Welcome to the TTT News Special. I'm DK Rossa. Thank you so much for joining us. And it seems as though I cut my hair to speak to a gentleman who's growing his. But we are speaking with attorney at law Keith Scotland. He joins us to share some of his informed opinion on police powers of entry to private premises. And it seems as though this is a view that differs a bit from the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago. But before we even get into that, Mr. Scotland, first of all, we want to thank you for making the time. And as MP for Port of Spain South, it seems as though there's some developments happening with Port of Spain South. So is there anything you'd want to tell us about that? I see some work on Arapita Avenue in Train.
There is a planned rejuvenation of Arapita Avenue, but before that commences, I have to meet with the stakeholders, the main residents and businesses, and that meeting is tomorrow at 6:30, I think, God's willing. And it is a consultative process. Nothing is etched in stone as yet. So what I would want to do in the first instance is really to have a meaningful conversation with the residents and also the businesses to get a consensus, to get what their views are. I can tell you that I've had groups of 3, my staff, and we are going house to house, business to business, from Bellsmith Street to Colville Street for the last week, and we are giving written questionnaires so persons could express their views, which I will take into account and submit an aid memoir to both honorable ministers and to UDIKE with the views of the constituents and the stakeholders being expressed and being heard, and that is being done. So I am doubling up. You know that about a week ago, Monday night, we had the public consultation, but I saw it fit to have this consultation between my constituents and myself for us to whisper, to have their views heard. And to back that up, we are doing the house to house, business to business, door to door with forms so that we can canvass their views. But it will be an exciting time once there's consensus amongst the main stakeholders. So that's very exciting.
And I appreciate the fact that you are, one, literally doing the legwork and also following guidelines, well, as they were up to that point. And that brings us to the conversation of hand. Because it seems as though there's a premise of the Law Association argument that I'd want, as you understand, to share with us. Thank you.
Well, there's been some disquiet promulgated by various stakeholders relative to the statements made by the Honorable Prime Minister to the effect that the police are able to intervene in private spaces, and the legality of such statements are being challenged. One of the stakeholders, and not just one, there are several persons, attorneys, but the Law Association was of the view that the Honorable Prime Minister was wrong. I am of the view that the Honorable Prime Minister was plainly right and statements are well founded. Before I express my view, I want to declare that there is a fact that I must put into the mix, being the member of Port of Spain South, for Parliament of Port of Spain South, and also a member of the People's National Movement. There is a specter of bias, because my views, you must take what I say from the angle in which I say it, meaning being a member of Parliament. So I've declared that. I've also declared that, of course, I'm a member of the Law Association. So that must be taken into account and must be counterbalanced. What I say, though, and I don't think, DK, that the public wants me to go into the niceties, but what I can say for those who want to have a sober and engaged discussion, and not what I've seen on social media, is that if you look at the legislative framework, which is the Public Health Ordinance, if you also look at the recent Court of Appeal decision in Suraj and others versus the Honorable Attorney General, and if you look at the pronouncements of Lord Hoffman in a case emanating from Trinidad called Suraj, and then you look at the Police Service Act, it is, to my mind, very clear that in the circumstances of a global pandemic, which has claimed several lives, which has infected over 11,300 persons as we speak, then in those circumstances, I think that if there's a gathering in private property or on private property that has the potential to breach those regulations, that the police, firstly, accompanied by, of course, ministry public health officials, would be entitled to enter onto those premises without a warrant. That's my first position. My second position is that even if there is not a public health official present and such a breach is occurring, even if it's on private premises, then I would think that the police officer, a police officer who is in charge to keep good peace and order, would be entitled, in order to ensure public survival, to enter those premises and arrest the situation. DK, the phrase that I have coined, public survival, is not a phrase coined by Keith Scotland, but it's a phrase that I have gleaned and taken wholesale from the Court of Appeal decision in Suraj and others. And would you permit me just to mention and just to re-quote so that the general public who want to listen and who want to engage in a meaningful discussion would understand what the law is. It may, and it may come to surprise others based on the views I've heard, it may come to a surprise to you to know that the Public Health Ordinance is constitutional law as stated by the Court of Appeal. So it's not unconstitutional. And at paragraph 106 of the judgment of Suraj, this is what the Court of Appeal had to say about that regulation. About that ordinance, sorry. The regulating making power at section 105 of the Public Health Ordinance has survived the scrutiny of Parliament on many occasions when this ordinance was considered and amended by Parliament. Accordingly, the Public Health Ordinance is not a statute which has reclined dormant for decades and which simply hides behind the savings law provision. This is a statute to which Parliament has been alive and which nonetheless has withstood the test of time. In the context of an enabling statute which itself confers extensive powers for the preservation of public survival, it seems that the court should now be slow to strike down subordinate legislation, so long as it is not strayed from the shelter of the parent statute. That is not me speaking. That is the Court of Appeal, the highest court of the land, speaking about the Public Health Ordinance, which gives the teeth to officers, particularly public health officers, to enter onto private premises, especially, and look at the phrase that the Court of Appeal used, for the preservation of public survival.
No, I hear you
Would you agree with me?
No, I hear you speaking about public survival, Mr. Scotland. And I want to dive into the conversation a little more in depth with regard to using that term when we return. But just before, how important is that caveat of being accompanied by a public health official? Because I can see, because a little earlier, another conversation you had, you gave the example of a policeman or a police officer walking along or moving past a situation and they look into a private premises and see someone being assaulted and not waiting for someone to be in conjunction with them or waiting for a warrant to go in. But I'm wondering if you can appreciate that that may seem a little more cut and dry. I don't necessarily want to say apples and oranges, but a little more cut and dry, a little less dubious or gray area than saying, okay, well, I think this may be a breach of public health ordinances.
I can address that and I will do it frontally. Would you agree with me, sir, that the current pandemic is a highly contagious virus? Can we agree on that?
One, yes, we agree on it, but two, we take a short break, return. When we return, you continue with your frontal address of that question. Stay with us, we will come back with more. Welcome back. We are speaking with attorney at law and MP for Port of Spain South, Mr. Keith Scotland, and he is going to frontally address the issue of saying how do police enter private premises if they're not accompanied by a public health official, and how grey are these areas that we're in right now?
I don't think that the areas are as grey as people make it out to be at this point in time. Let me start from the premise that we ascribe to the rule of law and the fact that there are constitutional rights for owners of private property to enjoy their property without being trespassed upon. And I acknowledge that, and that is why, in the first instance, I would say a police officer under these regulations intends to enter onto private property, it may be prudent that they do so accompanied by a public health official. And that's in the first instance. But that is if the situation allows it. In an ideal situation, that is what I would advocate, because I am a proponent of constitutional rights and individual constitutional rights. I give the caveat, and the caveat that I give is not a caveat coming from me, but I wish the public who want to engage in a meaningful, sober discussion. So I find, and I remind myself that one must not be thin-skinned, but I find that the narrative is not a narrative of sober minds and persons wanting to reason. And social media has promulgated and propagated that. So any person, that's the word I want to use. In fact, that's the word I want, but I will use that word for the purposes of this discourse. Any person can go, say what they think they wish, and not deal with the issues at hand. There was a case that went to the Privy Council from Trinidad and Tobago called Stuart. And this is what the Privy Council, Lord Bingham of Cornwall, had to say. Lord Bingham, at paragraph 58, stated that a constitutional right is not an absolute right. It cannot be said that in every case of an act of parliament which impinges in a way the rights on rights that are protected under sections 4 and 5 of the Constitution is for that reason alone unconstitutional. Legislation frequently affects rights such as freedom of thought and expression and the enjoyment of property. These are both qualified rights which may be limited either by general legislation or in a particular case, provided that limitation pursues a legitimate aim and is proportionate to it. So we're dealing with three issues: a constitutional right, which we say is not absolute, but legitimate aims and objectives and proportionate aims of the legislation. Would you not agree with me, sir, that a proportionate aim of this legislation is to ensure that we are not overrun by this potentially deadly virus? I think the answer has to be yes.
But my question, I'm answering your question with a question, in the sense that if there are these recent precedents, and if there are these judgments that have been handed down, and they are in black and white to the point that you can read from them, they're easily accessible, I think you're in a very nice nexus to answer the question, how is it that, or should I ask, let me ask it differently.
I've lost you.
I've
lost you on nexus.
Okay. Because you've stated that, yes, you are a member of the People's National Movement. You also state that you're a member of the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Is it that the Law Association is speaking for everyone but you?
I don't know, and I am content to be a voice in the wilderness, if that is, and I'm not a voice in the wilderness, but I'm content expressed my views, having declared my interest, once I have researched it properly, and I am willing to stand by it respectfully. And do you know something, sir? I may be wrong, you know. I may be wrong, but I must express my views. I must be heard, and I will not be silent.
But okay, so I take that point. Entering is one thing.
I'm losing you.
All right, are you hearing me now?
Yes, I am.
Great. Entering is one thing. Moving from entering to enforcing, how does that take place?
It takes place almost consecutively, and it follows because what you're entering for is to ensure that, one, there is no breach, and no breach that will cause this pandemic to spread. So let me give an example. A party of 20 where persons are not wearing their masks, where persons are not distancing, where persons are not washing their hands, but are engaged in, let us say, even an unsophisticated conga line. Isn't the police allowed to go there and just not arrest the situation, but to charge persons under the act? I think the answer ought to be yes. But more importantly, I want us to take the discussion away. I have showed you what my interpretation of the law is. I have cited the cases. I have read extensively from it. But let me put down let me close off my opinion. And let us talk for a minute. I wondered when Trinidad and Tobago became a place with this potential for putridity and a potential for not being as caring as we are. Because this pandemic really affects, in the first instance, the most vulnerable in our society, the elderly, the grannies, the persons who you would call granny, who I would call granny, who I would, if I'm behaving poorly in a public space and I see them coming, I will adjust my behavior at least until they pass, and then I will continue with my associates. What about them? Let's put aside all this talk about private property. When did we as a society lose track and lose sight of context? Because if you recall, the Honorable Prime Minister did not make these comments in a vacuum. It was made in a context of an uplift and augmentation and increase in numbers of cases. It went from 40 to 80 to 100 to 200 to 300 per day. And it is in those contexts he called for responsible behavior. And what do we have? Law Association coming out and saying, well, he is wrong, and not focusing on the main issue. What about our conduct that will not propagate, that will not encourage such increases in numbers? And when I made my views, I looked at the comments on social media. One of them, I must tell you, one person likened me to a gorilla, and I was very, very proud of my heritage. I was very proud. But that is the type of comment that you will get because I've expressed my views. I rebuke that, you know. And I will speak in this country, and I will say respectfully that the Honorable Prime Minister has handled this situation with balance, sobriety, and with an even-handedness that this country ought to be grateful at this point in time for that type of leadership.
Welcome back to our conversation with Keith Scotland, MP for Port of Spain South, as well as an attorney at law, about the premise or entering private premises. That's the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service entering premises. And it seems as though the letter of the law, spirit of the law, there's a juxtaposition with that and people's rights. Now, let me put this forward, and I'll get your take on it, please, Mr. Scotland. It seems as though this is a period that individuals can feel so powerless that they're trying to take power anyhow they can. So they're trying to hold on to these rights and perceived rights, even though they may not be absolute in this period. What is your take on that?
There is no need and there is no justification for any feeling of powerlessness, and uh, particularly or with specific reference to this scenario. And let me tell you why. Sir, you are a journalist and a reporter and also an investigative reporter. How many cases have you heard of police officers trespassing on private property to the disadvantage of homeowners? How many have you heard of?
With regard to the
Pardon?
COVID-19 pandemic,
Yes.
actually
How many?
it feels as though is the opposite in some instances where police are very remiss to do that.
Thank you. In other words, the fears, they are a heuristic creation. It is something, it's a conversation piece, but it does not happen. And do you know why it does not happen? Because there is a balance. So think about it. We are talking about something. I had to spend my weekend doing, and I had to put my opinion in writing because of my membership in Parliament. I don't want it to be said. As it has been said, imagine, because I have expressed my view, it is said that I sing for my supper. As I said on another forum, I have a very simple supper, dry bread and butter, so I don't have to sing for anything. I sing my own tune and very much out of tune. But it has not happened. But yet there's this conversation in the air that people like it as a conversation piece, and it generates this talk. Whilst the vulnerable are falling down, falling prey to this, the vulnerable. Why don't the voices speak about the vulnerable? So that is the test of powerlessness. How are you powerless when no one has infringed? And mind you, if there's an infringement, do you know that section 14 and 15 of the Constitution allows a person who is aggrieved to challenge that in the courts of law, just as Stuart did, just as Sturaj did, just as Submarine Mirage did? So there's always redress. And I am not saying that it should reach there, but I'm saying that the empirical data, the empirical evidence does not support any theory of any erosion of fundamental rights. But it's a good conversation piece for people to go on social media and express themselves in a very uncivilized manner, and to talk and to criticize the government. And I think respectfully, unfairly, you're entitled to criticize. Huh? You're entitled to criticize. But in these circumstances, I want to appeal to a better Trinidad and Tobago. And mind you, if you're right and if you feel that a police officer has crossed the line and not gone for the legitimate and limited purpose for which I say that my opinion addresses, by all means, to the state. But it has not happened.
And with regard to that appeal for right thinking, that appeal to be our brothers and sisters keepers, yes, you harkened on the fact that it is easy to cast your thoughts and to share them, but how do people access information like the opinion that you've put out to add that to the conversation so they can assimilate if they choose to, and that may help to inform their thinking one way or the other as they continue with their conversations, Mr. Scott?
I have smiled because that is the type of discourse that I have. I will make my opinion. My opinion is available, and it's available for persons to read. Sometimes it's available that you read, you throw it in the trash bin if necessary. But I will make it available because those are my views, and I put it in writing because I thought that the criticisms that were being leveled by the maker of the statement, they were unfounded and unjust. And I have come out, I have reared my head because I think that in a just thinking society, this ought to be done. The last point that I made about you've not heard one instance of it, it proves my point that rights are not being trampled upon. And if so, the courts are not shut here, the courts are open, and they're open for persons to challenge the infringement of any of the enshrined rights if they feel that the police officer has acted poorly and has overreached and tried to take advantage of this situation. But there's no instance of it, sir.
All right.
Have you heard and reported on one instance?
No, I haven't. And just before we bring this conversation to a close, I'm going to try to do what some people say is impossible, peg down an attorney at law. You said you will make your opinion public and accessible. Where will people be able to, or individuals be able to find that opinion, Mr. Scotland?
I am not tech savvy, but I have someone who is tech savvy. You have stumped me there. You tell me a platform in which I can share it, and I will share it on the platform. How about that?
Very good. I think we may be able to do it right.
Tech savvy.
I think we may be able to do it right here at TTT.
I will have it available. I have someone who I know can do it, and I will make it available to TTT.
All right.
You have my word on that.
Thank you very much. I feel this is a blue moon occasion. Attorney at law just told me that I stumped him. We take that and we move forward with it. But thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for putting in that work, both the legwork as well as bringing some of those precedents that we can look at and say, okay, well, I may think about this a little differently now. I may move a little differently with this now. I feel my sentiments are a little different. So thank you very much for that, Mr. Scotland.
Sir, very welcome, sir.
All right, and we want to thank you on behalf of the entire news team for tuning in. This is the TTT News Special.